Welcome to this week's ARC's lunchtime talk. We're really excited to have the speaker today, but I have a few announcements before then. And that is that next week's talk is on Zoom only, I just read. The itinerary of a lead repair, or how to do an archaeology of slavery in ancient Greece, which sounds great. And that is with Sarah Erickson, late of UC Berkeley, maybe still of UC Berkeley, but of University of Bonn as well. So that'll be interesting. And again, I just want to announce, as I did last week, that on Thursday, February 20th, which is coming up, it's what, the 12th today? So next week, actually, I think. Shannon Tushingham, Dr. Shannon Tushingham of the Cal Academy of Sciences over there, if you've ever been to the Golden Gate Parks Museum, is going to be here as our special spring lecture titled Resilient Foodways, Kalispell, Ethnoarchaeology, Earth Ovens, and the Science of Ancestral Diets. And that will be in person only in this very room. Reception at 4:30 with nibbles and drinks that you can then bring into the talk. And that will be at 5 p.m. is the talk here. And that goes out on the weekly announcement if you get that. And then the CRM panel for anybody and everybody is Friday, March 7th at 3 p.m. also in this room. So please come if you're at all interested in learning about what CRM archaeology is really like, and do tell your students. Are there any other announcements that I'm missing? Yay, okay, good, let's go. Okay, so today we have a title up here already, but I am going to say something about Francesca, or Cesca, she likes to be called LaPasta. And she's a candidate, a PhD candidate in the Classical Archaeology Department of Ancient Greek and Roman Studies, or daggers, as we call it now. Her research focuses on domestic archaeology, social history, and lived experience of enslaved people. So the enslaved themes, this time in Greece, no, Pompeii, excuse me. So both, like next week, they're both, no, that was this time in Roman, sorry, next time in Greece, excuse me. Yes. Sorry, getting it organized. Okay, so she's obviously worked in Pompeii, and you've worked, I assume, with Ted Pena, late emeritus, well, not late yet, late professor, now retired, Ted Pena, Professor Theodore Pena, late took daggers, I should say. That's where I was going. He's currently working on, and he's actually here and alive. He got so excited he got this work. Late. Where I was going. Sorry. So she's now working on her dissertation and explores the intersection of slavery and security in houses in Pompeii, which is why we saw that gated picture, I guess, in your, you were showing locked up rooms at 2 levels, both now and then. So we're really pleased to hear about your work. So thank you very much, Cesca, for coming, and thank you for being here, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, today I'll be talking about the Ostiarius. This presentation, which is based on the data from the main part of one chapter of my dissertation, grew from my desire to recognize enslaved people in the material record of Rome. Classicists have often taken a pessimistic view towards utilizing archaeological data to learn more about the lives of those of low social status in ancient Rome. Although publications of the past 2 decades, such as Sandra Joshel and Lauren Hackworth-Peterson's The Material Life of Roman Slaves and the edited volume Roman Slavery and Roman Material Culture, have prompted a certain degree of interest in material approaches, there have still been limited studies taking on this difficult topic. My approach generally is to focus on an area in which slavery and material culture were intimately connected in the Roman world, that of security. One place where these 2 things come into contact very clearly is in the figure of the Ostiarius, or doorkeeper. The doorkeeper was typically an enslaved individual, and their job was to guard the entrance of a house and control access. This included monitoring outsiders who wanted to enter a house, as well as members of the household coming and going. Briefly, I want to give an overview of Roman slavery. Unlike historical slavery in the Americas, Roman slavery was not racially based, and people from a wide variety of races and ethnicities were enslaved. This is not to say that there were no racial elements in Roman slavery, as enslaved people of certain races and ethnicities were sought out for certain types of labor and cost different amounts, and there were stereotyped conceptions about how enslaved people looked and acted. Enslaved people in the ancient Roman world could enter slavery in a number of ways, including capture and war, being born into slavery, piracy, and child abandonment, among others. Manumission was possible, allowing a minority of enslaved people to exit slavery and become Roman citizens. Enslaved people undertook a wide variety of types of labor, including harsh manual labor, such as agricultural work and mining, as well as producing goods such as pottery and more intellectual work, such as acting as secretaries and tutors. Despite the ubiquity of enslaved people, indeed, Walter Scheidel has estimated there were 5 to 8 million enslaved people in Italy in the imperial period, tracing them in the archaeological record has proven difficult. Another aspect of Roman slavery that sets it apart from slavery in the United States, particularly in the urban setting I've been studying, or in not the United States, in the America, is that often there were not designated slave quarters in the house. Enslaved people lived alongside their enslavers and inhabited the same spaces. As I've been considering how to find evidence of enslaved people and their lives in Roman material culture, I have been drawn to the city of Pompeii. This interest was fostered by my advisor, Ted Pena, who's here with us today, when I came to Berkeley, and I've had the privilege to work in Pompeii for the past 3 summers as part of the project that Ted directs, the Pompeii Artifact Life History Project, also known as PALHIP. The city is located in the Bay of Naples in southern Italy. It was founded in the 6th century BCE by a native Italic group known as the Oscans. The city later became an ally of Rome in 290 BCE before being made a colony and completely incorporated into the Roman Empire after its defeat as part of the losing side of the social wars in around 80 BCE. The city, which was a relatively prosperous trading port because of its location near the coast, was badly damaged by an earthquake in 62 CE before being totally destroyed by the eruption of the volcano Vesuvius in 79 CE. This terrible destruction, which took the lives of many of the inhabitants of Pompeii and the surrounding area, also led to an incredible level of preservation and a deposition context in which objects were left in a state very similar to when the city was inhabited. Although the image of a city perfectly preserved in a single moment isn't totally accurate, Pompeii does offer an opportunity to understand the intricate workings of a Roman city and individual households to a degree that is not possible elsewhere. A note on the way that the address system works in the city, as I'll be using it to reference different houses and areas. The city is divided into 9 regiones or regions, and each of those regions is divided into insulae, which are basically blocks. Note that there isn't a standard size for an insula, so some are larger and some are irregular in shape. In each block, houses are designated by door numbers. There are also still large sections of the city which have not been excavated, which you can see marked on this map in green. My work so far has focused on questions surrounding where doorkeepers would be stationed within Pompeian houses, with specific emphasis on certain rooms for doorkeepers, something that is mentioned in ancient Roman literature. By tracing these spaces, I hope to be able to understand the distribution of enslaved people in the city of Pompeii and how security may have differed across different houses and neighborhoods. After this larger scale analysis, I plan to investigate individual rooms within houses, including the objects found inside, in order to try and gain insight into the lives of enslaved people. The presence of doorkeepers in Pompeii is directly attested by 2 inscriptions, which mention janitores, another Latin word for doorkeeper. The literary record suggests that at least some proportion of Roman houses had a room designated for a doorkeeper, which who controlled access to the house, as well as monitoring household members' movement. Well, there has been some interest in this room type, particularly as connected to the enslaved member of the household who would have occupied it. There have been no systematic studies of spaces which may have had this purpose. No standard definition of what the space should consist of exists either in ancient texts or modern scholarship, making establishing standards for such a space a major part of my project. While I have taken account of the literary record to some extent, the references provide very little description, basically amounting to the fact that the doorkeeper's room is near the front of the house and would have easy access to the entrance. For example, in Petronius's novel, The Satirica, guests at a dinner party encounter the doorkeeper immediately upon entering the house. In aditu autem ipso stabat Ostiarius. Moreover, in the very entrance, a doorkeeper was standing. The famously flashy freedman Trimalchio, who is hosting the dinner party, later makes a speech suggesting that a suitable room for a doorkeeper is an important part of a wealthy man's home. And that's what you see up here, saying, under the protection of Mercury, I built this house. As you know, it was still a cottage. Now it is a temple. It has 4 dining rooms, 20 bedrooms, 2 marble colonnades, a series of rooms upstairs, a bedroom where I sleep, the boudoir of this viper, he's talking about his wife, a nice office, and a nice office for the doorman. So that's Ostiari Calam per bonum, a really good room for the doorkeeper. While only the most decadent houses in Pompeii could rival the one described by the fictional Trimalchio, this quotation still makes it clear that the doorkeeper's room was on the mind of wealthy Romans. In the same text, another reference is made to the doorkeeper's room in Trimalchio's house. Argentine Ostiarii ilias cala plus jacet quam quisquam infortunus habet. There's more silver in the room of his doorkeeper than any of us has in his entire fortune. This also points to an important caveat for my study of doorkeepers' rooms. I'm not trying to suggest that rooms within Pompeian houses had only one purpose. While I do believe that certain rooms were especially suitable for a doorkeeper, the spaces were likely multi-purpose, including being used for storage, food preparation, sleeping, or a myriad of other things. My own consideration of the doorkeeper's room has been based on the function of the room and the typical organization of Pompeian houses. Here's a plan that shows some of the basic aspects of a Roman peristyle house, so-called. While the terms shown here have been critiqued for relying too much on ancient literature and not actually having a connection to Pompeian houses on the ground, I use them as they are generally understood by modern scholars as a useful labeling convention. At the most basic level, the doorkeeper's room must be adjacent to a door from the exterior into the house, whether this is a front or back door. The room must also have a way to observe movement into and out of the house. I've included spaces with 2 different features that allow for this. One is direct access to an entrance corridor, the front entrance corridor being called the fauces, so you see that term come up. And the other is a window to the street. My initial survey of properties in Pompeii has erred on the side of including all spaces which have these features regardless of additional factors such as size and height of window, or decoration, which may make the space less suitable for use as a doorkeeper's room. This means that some properties have multiple potential doorkeeper's rooms reported. This chart shows the numbers of each type of potential doorkeeper's rooms that I've recorded throughout the city so far, with data collection still ongoing for a small section of Regio 9. The 2 most common types are rooms adjacent to an entrance with a window to the street, and spaces with access directly to the fauces. That's the front entrance corridor, as you can see. And actually, none is kind of the biggest category that actually lots of houses don't have them at all, right? My method has been to systematically survey all of the properties in Pompeii that are categorized as residential spaces using the base map of Pompeii created by the Pompeii Bibliography and Mapping Project in ArcGIS. This map utilizes the plan of the city created by Dr. Hans Escabach, published in 1970, as well as Escabach's designations of property type. I cross-referenced this map with the recently released map from the Soprintendenza Archaeologica di Pompeii, which is called Open Pompeii, that sometimes has updated information. While using the plans of the houses from these maps can sometimes provide the necessary information to determine whether a space fits my criteria for a doorkeeper's room, I use the images of properties in Pompeii from the website Pompeii in Pictures, from which a majority of the images of individual houses in this presentation come, in order to gain additional information about rooms, such as whether they were decorated or contained any fittings, as well as to check the information shown on the maps. For example, the maps do not always include the location of windows, making it necessary to check the images of individual properties to determine whether the spaces adjacent to a property's entrance had windows looking onto the street. I record information about each residential property in an Excel spreadsheet, logging data such as the total ground floor area, whether there is evidence of an upper floor, and the number and types of entrances to each house. These pieces of information allow me to evaluate a household's wealth, as shown in the size of the homes, as well as the degree and type of access to each property. For example, many homes in Pompeii have connected commercial spaces, a factor which I believe may contribute to the need for a doorkeeper for security purposes. I then record whether there are any spaces which fulfill my criteria for a doorkeeper's room, breaking these into the various categories mentioned earlier, based on whether they are adjacent to a front or back entrance and whether they have direct access to the entrance corridor or have a window to the street. As I record such spaces in the spreadsheet, I also mark them on my own version of the Pompeii Bibliography Mapping Project map, using different colors to differentiate the various types. This mapping also helps me trace patterns across neighborhoods, which is difficult to determine based on my spreadsheet. While I'm at the early stages of analyzing this data and still have a little data collection to do, a few interesting patterns have already become clear. One that is particularly thought-provoking for me is that properties with a larger ground floor area are less likely to have rooms that fit the criteria of doorkeepers' rooms that are adjacent to a front entrance, so directly off the facies. One aspect of this is that large houses tend to have commercial spaces near their front entrances, but it still seems somewhat counterintuitive to me that large properties do not usually have a doorkeeper's room directly off of their facies. It has often been assumed that the wealthiest people who had the largest houses would have doorkeepers' rooms, partially by analogy with the outrageously wealthy Trimalchio that we met before. But my data pushes back on this assumption to some degree. In contrast, smaller houses were the most likely to have a room directly off their facies, suitable for observing movement in and out of the house. So that's at the bottom there. One explanation for this that I'm considering is if the larger houses would have relied on a large household staff to self-police, as well as to keep watch throughout the house. While smaller properties may have had to use architectural organization to keep an eye on access, large and opulent places could use their large labor force and do away with the specific room where a doorkeeper could be stationed. Another preliminary observation is that certain types of doorkeepers' rooms seem to cluster throughout the city. For example, we can see here that there is a concentration of spaces labeled in red in this area, denoting rooms adjacent to front entrances with windows to the street. This is on the east side of Reggio 6, Insula 7, and the west side of Reggio 6, Insula 9. So these kind of grouping of red right here. This could perhaps be accounted for by the properties in similar areas being built at around the same time when certain architectural features were popular or more standard. It may also reflect the character of certain areas of the town, such as heightened issues with break-ins or a high number of places where enslaved people could hide after covertly leaving the house. This specific area is not far from the Porta Ercolano, one of the city gates. From the property at address 693, which is kind of in the center of my circle, it's about 365 meters to the Porta Ercolano gate, about a quarter of a mile or an approximately 5-minute walk. The nearness of an exit from the city may have made it more likely for strangers to be in the area of the city or for enslaved people to attempt flight. thus necessitating additional safety features with a focus on viewing the outside from the inside of the house. Another pattern that is possible to uncover just by looking at the distribution on the map is that there are very few spaces that fit my criteria for doorkeepers' rooms in the insulae adjacent to the forum. So here's the forum at the center, and it's kind of a lack of seeing things here, but there's not many of those little colored marking rooms here. In the blocks that border the forum, there are only 7 spaces that I have determined may have been doorkeepers' rooms. One reason for this is that the area near the forum tends to be taken up by more commercial and public space than other parts of the city, but this doesn't completely account for the low number. While I haven't established a strong theory for this yet, it is perhaps because this area was full of people, and thus the busyness of the area made it more difficult for potential thieves to get away with their crimes. While I had initially suspected that the house size might be greater in this area than in other parts of the city, thus correlating with my earlier claim that larger houses were less likely to have certain types of doorkeepers' rooms, looking at the data, this doesn't seem to be the case. Here's a chart showing the average ground floor area of domestic spaces by Reggio and Insula. I did remove a few outliers from this data set, such as the colossal Prydia of Julia Felix, which is partially domestic and thus relevant for my exploration of doorkeepers' rooms, but is really a multi-use complex rather than a single house. The average across the whole city with outliers removed is 518.38 meters, and that's shown by, oh no, the orange line. The orange line didn't show up in that other one. Shown by this orange line is that, yeah, average. While the domestic properties in the two insulae to the south of the forum do have higher than average ground floor areas, the other 2 bordering the forum on its east and west actually have lower than average house ground floor areas, with the average across all of them being about 550 square meters, slightly higher than the citywide average. It's an example of a pattern I've noticed that I've yet to find a satisfactory answer for, but one that I hope to understand better as I work through more of the data. And also I'm very happy to hear if anyone has thoughts and suggestions. I now want to turn to 2 case studies to give a more fine-grained look at the houses I'm studying and to give a sense of the kinds of spaces that fit my criteria. First, I'm going to focus on a large house with multiple potential doorkeepers' rooms, which shows the range of types that can appear in the same property. Then I'll focus in on a more modest house that I have additional data for from my time with PalHip, allowing me to incorporate some small finds from the room I've identified as a potential doorkeeper room. So let's take a look now at the Casa del Chitarrista, or the House of the Kitharist. This is a very large house with a ground floor area of around 2,308 square meters, located in Insula 4 of Reggio 1. This plan showing the house in white shows just how many rooms this property has. It is likely that it was once multiple houses that were combined into a large structure that takes up much of the block. Here's an image from my map that's made in ArcGIS that's a bit easier to parse. The color coding of entire buildings denotes the building's function according to Escabach, with yellow marking shops, purple marking workshops, dark blue entertainment buildings such as inns, and beige residential buildings. Note that many buildings would have been multifunctional, such as shops with back rooms or mezzanines where people would have lived. This is just kind of showing it as one-dimensional. Looking at my own additions to this map, you can see the individual rooms, which are marked by certain colors. In this case, there are 3 rooms marked in the house. So off the Fauques here, there's a room labeled in light blue showing direct access to that front entrance corridor, while one of the 2 back doors has 2 potential doorkeepers' rooms, one which has a window to the street and one which has both a window to the street and direct access to the back entrance, to that back entrance corridor. Starting with the room off the front of the house, so that's at the front there, we can first see the view from the street. This is one of Pompeii's main drags, the Via dell'Abbondanza. As you might have noticed in the plan, this house's entrance is flanked by shops, making it impossible to have rooms with windows directly onto the street at the front of this house. So instead, this room is able to monitor the front entrance through a doorway onto the relatively narrow falques. Here you can see that not only does this room have an entrance to the falques, which is that one looking towards us, it also has an entrance into the atrium, the large open room that the falques leads to. The room itself is very plain, with no traces of decoration surviving and no fixtures suggesting a specific purpose. Considering sight lines from this room, it's clear that it would be relatively easy to monitor movement into and out of the house through the falques, as well as people's movements in the area of the atrium and the many rooms that were accessed from the atrium. So just from one vantage point, you can see a lot. Now moving to the back of the house, there are two spaces that fit my criteria for potential doorkeepers' rooms. Not that I'm actually claiming that both of these would be used for that purpose, but as I said, my initial survey has tended towards including all potential rooms. One of these rooms has direct access to the back entrance corridor, as well as potentially two windows to the street, and the other just has a window to the street. I'll start with the room with both a window and access to the falques, the entrance to which you can see on the right in this picture, going down this entrance hallway. As you can see, it's another pretty plain room, though there is some plaster preserved on the walls. Notice that the doorway to this room is shorter than the main doorway from the street. So this is the entrance to this room, and you can see up here, that's the height of the entrance from the street. As I said, there are actually two, that noticing of the doorway is something that Joshua and Hackworth Peterson, alongside others, have argued might indicate service rooms. So shorter doorway entrances, they kind of connect to service areas. So there are, in fact, two potential windows in this room, though one is quite rough and may actually have been the result of damage to the house. And then these rectangular indents that you see in the walls are beam holes to support an upper floor in this room. Though the window is a bit high, I still think it could have been suitable for observing movement outside of the house, while the access to the back entrance corridor would have made it easier to monitor movement moving from inside to outside. The room with the window on the other side of the entrance corridor also has beam holes for an upper floor and is quite plain with a short doorway. While both could reasonably fulfill the function of a doorkeeper's room, it seems more likely that the first we looked at would be suitable, with its ease of monitoring movement through the entrance corridor and the street. The next steps I hope to pursue for the House of the Kitharus is to see if any small finds are recorded from the excavation, although because this house was primarily excavated in the mid to late 1800s, it's unlikely that many objects were recorded or kept. I acknowledge that at this point, I'm at an early stage of using the material record to investigate slavery, which is to say, yes, there were enslaved people here, but actually this is something that hasn't always been done in classical archaeology. Even having a way to identify the omnipresent but invisible enslaved members of a household is a step forward in learning more about the lives of the enslaved. I hope as I continued with my work on the house, I can move closer to recognizing the actual experiences of enslaved people. The next case study is a more modest house that's in the block 111, which was studied by Palhip in its more recent phase, most recent. The block is made up mostly of domestic properties of moderate size that were primarily excavated in the 1950s and 60s, meaning that some find spots were recorded and many of the objects are still preserved in Pompeii's on-site storehouse. Unfortunately, even at the time, collection practices were focused on valuable objects and materials, so there are many objects, such as the majority of the ceramics, that were not kept. I'm going to be focusing in on one house from this block, sometimes called the Casa de Euxinus, with the address 11112. The ground floor area of the main part of the house is only about 123 square meters, but at the rear of the property, there's also a large open area that was used for growing grapes, something which we know because of Wilhelmina Yashemski's pioneering work on gardens in Pompeii and the surrounding areas utilizing root casts. With the addition of the open garden areas, the ground floor area of the property is about 775 square meters, still significantly smaller than the enormous house of the Kitharus, but the largest property in this block by a large margin. Looking back briefly at the average size of houses in Pompeii, we can see the average for this block is lower than the citywide average by a good amount. Looking from the street, we can instantly see that there are two rooms that meet my criteria in terms of having windows to the street. Looking back at my map, we can see there's a clustering of this type of space in the southwest of the block. Seems that having spaces with windows to the street was a popular feature of houses in this area. This plan shows us in more detail the spaces that we're going to be looking at, labeled as 3 and 4. You can see from this that neither space has access to the fauces, making the window the main opportunity for monitoring movement on the outside of the house, and a view into the atrium as the way to monitor movement inside. We'll start with number 3, which is on the right in this image. This space has a relatively high window and has plaster that shows signs of being painted. You can see here that in addition to the doorway into the atrium, there's also a small window to the atrium from this room, which could also be useful in terms of monitoring that space. In the corner with that window, there's also an interesting masonry feature. It's not clear what it was used for, though its placement by the window may suggest that the two are connected. Looking at space 4, we can see that it also has a pretty high window to the street, and also that the walls preserve a more colorful and intricate decoration, including yellow panels and a red lower zone. Unlike its counterpart on the other side of the fauces, this room does not have a window to the atrium or any masonry features. And overall, I will admit it is probably the less likely of the two to be the doorkeeper's room. But as all of us here probably know, sometimes you have to follow the path that you have more information about. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this room. Fortunately, using the database created by PalHip for the household assemblages from this block, I was able to dig a little deeper. 30 objects are recorded in the database as having come from this property, with only 4 of those objects having a listed find spot in the records we've accessed so far. Of these 4, 3 come from the room described as being situated to the right of the fauces, which I take to be room 4. Though it's a bit ambiguous since the description uses right and left and doesn't specify cardinal directions. These objects are all made from bronze, one potential reason why they were noted and kept, and we have information on the find spot from the work of Suzanne Tassanari, giving a description of all the bronze vessels from Pompeii. The objects found in this room include an object described as a dipping vessel, though it may have had many different uses, and it has a hole in its handle, likely for hanging on the wall. There's a bronze amphora with handles with a vegetal decoration, and a bronze bucket with iron handle attachments, though the handle has broken away. It's hard to come to any sweeping conclusions based on these objects, but at least the so-called dipping vessel and the bucket seem to serve perhaps a utilitarian purpose, while the amphora seems perhaps more decorative. Maybe it's appropriate to imagine enslaved members of the household utilizing these objects, maybe for transporting water and measuring it or drinking from the dipping vessel. In the larger context of the assemblage, these are the only bronze vessels found in the house, suggesting that there may have been some designated storage area for the bronze vessels in this area. In further work on the house, I plan to look into the find spots of the other objects in the hopes of understanding more fully the assemblage's distribution. I will say in reference to these vessels being in this space, which fits one of my criteria for a doorkeeper's room, that I have found that there are often features suggesting that spaces were used as service areas that correlate with potential doorkeepers' rooms. While water provisioning might be at play in this example, other features include latrines and kitchens. 7 of the rooms I identified have a kitchen denoted by a masonry hearth or oven. 14 have latrines and 16 have both kitchen features and a latrine. Here's a little example of a room with both the kitchen and latrine from 658, and the image on the right shows a bit of the view into the Fouquets from that room. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think that rooms in Pompeii necessarily only had one purpose, and I think it is possible that rooms were used as kitchens, latrines, and doorkeepers' rooms simultaneously. While what I've presented to you today is still at its early stages, I hope that it gives a sense of the direction that I'm moving with the project, as well as the great potential of investigating these rooms and seriously trying to answer the question of how we might see enslaved people in the houses of Pompeii and in Roman material culture and architecture more generally. As I move forward, I hope to learn more about individual houses, including aspects that I didn't have a chance to look at for today, such as graffiti, as well as to move beyond the material from Pompeii to explore the figure of the doorkeeper in other places, such as through inscriptions and Roman legal texts. This work also fits into my larger dissertation project, which looks at the intersection between slavery and security in Roman homes more generally, including a consideration of locks and keys for both doors and storage containers, as well as restraint devices such as fetters, manacles, and chains, and integration of critical fabulation and considerations of resistance, particularly from the perspective of flight from slavery. I want to thank my committee, particularly Grace, Ernie, and Ted Pena, who are here with us in the room today, as well as all the people who have helped me with my work in Pompeii, and especially Susanna, who is in Pompeii right now and is tuning in on Zoom. Hi, Susanna. And I'm very happy to take questions or thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Maybe I'll do that.
Thank you for your talk. Very excited about any kind of spatially integrated social science. I think it's really exciting. And so my question is kind of tiered, and it goes theoretical, analytical, methodological.
Yeah.
Right. Which is theoretically, my understanding, and I'm an American Southwest archaeologist. What do I know about Rome? Right. But my understanding of the Satyricon is that a lot of what's being depicted, lavishly, is aspirational. Right. And so if that's the case, that we have an aspiration to have door people doing door things, right? The next level of the question is analytical, where I think you started to get there, which was really exciting, which was what is the view shed from that space? And not just for what can the door person see from that space, but what invigilation is there of those spaces as people come in and maybe use the dipping thing to drink or whatever, right? Yeah. From outside into that space, right? Because if the doorman is aspirational, you don't really have that person, but you have the nook that might serve that space, how is its use or its projection of wealth be a part of performance? And then methodologically, coming down even narrower, if you have, I'm assuming there's some sort of, facets for doors, bolts and things for doors. You mentioned keys. I got all excited. Is there a way for you to discern which doors? Because you talked about people having to go through businesses and, just by vein of trying to protect your inventory, you could see how there'd be a lot of vigilation there. But in the places where that isn't the case, in all those little locks and brackets and hinges for your doors are there, do you discern a difference that you could say, oh, these are way higher security portices than there are than So
So,
that was a lot. I'm sorry.
No, let's go. So first with the Satirica, I do think you're right that it's an aspirational thing. I chose that as an example. That's not the only place that it comes up. It comes up in Seneca's letters. It comes up in a lot of different places that we see people mentioning the doorkeepers' rooms. But I do think it's interesting, this aspirational aspect, and like the idea that you'd have a space in your house for this, even if you don't have an enslaved person to fulfill that role. I'm also interested in part of this chapter. I think we'll also talk a little bit about dogs as kind of guard dogs, which actually in the literature, there's often this like strange kind of correlation and kind of collapsing of the doorkeeper and the guard dog as like having the same purpose. And we even see examples in the literature of people, enslaved doorkeepers actually being chained to the house like a dog. So I'll say we haven't really found any archaeological evidence of that. But yeah, there's this idea of different types of guarding happening in the house. Okay, and then the next question about view sheds, and that's something that Josh L. and Hackworth Peterson work a lot with in their book, and something that I'm starting to think about. And I do think it's an interesting perspective to think of from the outside in, looking around, because this is also something that's interesting to me about enslaved people in these household contexts too, that there's seems to be, enslaved people are guarding and watching other enslaved people. There's this kind of, and it's kind of complicated, and it makes us feel icky, it's like, but yeah, this is something that's happening. I don't know if that really answered that.
Absolutely. I'm admiring all the GIS you're doing and thinking about ways that you could use those rasters to get, to nuance some of the things you're saying.
Still at the very beginning of that, but I'm really interested in working with that. Okay, and then the last part of the question,
which is about the little bits and pieces that might give you a sense for the levels of security.
There have been people who are working on that. Taylor Lauritsen has worked on a lot of the doorways, and that is something that I'm also going to be looking at in my dissertation, locks and keys, and how the door fittings and all of those things factor into. And I actually just gave a presentation at the AIA about the plaster cast of a specific door. It's a really, I'll just say in 1 second, it's a door, the interior of a door cast, and we can see that it has a lock that you lock from the interior, and it also has a wooden bar on the interior across it. So I'm my idea there was that, if you want to keep people from the outside getting in, you just need that bar on the interior. That stops people from getting in. But if you want to stop people from getting out, you need that lock on the inside. So that's for the control of the household, including enslaved people.
Right on, man. So many cool things. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Sophie next.
Thank you so much for your talk. That was really fascinating. I was wondering what sort of evidence, either textual or archaeological, have you encountered of thievery, home invasion, escaping of enslaved people that would be threats or perceived threats of wealthy Roman homeowners as they're constructing these buildings?
Yeah. So one big part of that is the legal text, right? So in Roman legal texts, we have a lot of examples of kind of specific laws about enslaved people escaping, about trying to stop kind of making sure security. And there's also specific laws that are differentiated between enslaved people and free people for things like theft and different crimes. So that's one place where we're seeing that there's kind of this designated interest. And the other thing is what I just mentioned, right, about the doorkeepers seem to be sometimes, at least in literary record, chained to the house, right? So that's implying some kind of very kind of interesting concern that is built into the house to have this doorkeeper or some enslaved person to guard, but also to keep that person from escaping or anything like that, because they do have some kind of level of trust within the household, right? They're guarding, they're keeping watch. So that's one thing. This is, again, kind of what I'm trying to figure out, that, for example, in Vitruvius, he's talking about, an author talking about houses and Greek and Roman houses. He mentions doorkeepers' rooms, that this is something, but he actually talks about it on the Greek side. He says the Greek houses have the doorkeeper's room in this area, and then we have kind of a lacuna of like what does that mean that the Roman houses also have them, or they don't have them, or something like that? So that's another example where we know at least Vitruvius, who was, you know, Roman, and he was talking about building Roman houses, was thinking about doorkeepers' rooms and security and stuff like that. Thank you. Yes, Sophie? I saw your hand first.
Also check the
Oh, the Zoom. Oh, good. There's something in the chat too. Oh, just.
Oh, thanks, Cesca. This is so interesting, and I'm super impressed by all of the data that you've compiled and the many different things that you're doing with it. Something that I was struck by is the kind of lack of possible doorkeepers' rooms that open onto the street or have a doorway onto the street.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if there's any evidence, and I suppose it'd have to be textual because I don't know how you would detect this archaeologically, that doorkeepers were just stationed on the street rather than in a room. It's kind of the first part of the question, but I think it's related to the questions you're asking and the point that you made about doorkeepers controlling access, but also being controlled by the spaces in which they're stationed.
Yeah, this is a really good question, and one that I'm kind of grappling with of like, yeah, there doesn't have to be a room, right? There's nothing saying there has to be a specific room in the house for doorkeepers. This is something that I'm working through because then I can, you know, trace more information about those specific rooms and get more fine-grained information. But I totally think it's possible that doorkeepers are stationed like at the very, you know, even in that example from the Satirica, right? It's like the doorkeeper's at the very front of the house. He's like in the doorway. So I think that's definitely possible. And then also that a doorkeeper might just be stationed in the Falques itself, like in that front entrance corridor. And we actually have some possible like evidence of that. There's this one house that Rebecca Benefield has published on that has these marks, like graffiti scratched into the wall of the Falques that looks like counting perhaps the number of people that were coming in. And she's connected that to this doorkeeper figure and suggested maybe, yeah, a doorkeeper stationed in the Falques and somehow like keeping track of how many people are coming and going in the house. So yeah, that's an avenue that I'm still thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you. Really fascinating delve into little spaces there, which are always intriguing. Question, I was kept wondering, where does this phenomenon of the doorkeeper and the doorkeeper's space and so forth room appear in the archaeological record? Where else is it? You mentioned Greece. Where else in the ancient world or elsewhere do we see this? And when does it start to pop up?
This is a very good question that I can't really say I have a lot of information on. Looking at comparisons, I've looked at Greece a little bit, but I haven't really looked like houses in Egypt. Perhaps would be an interesting example, or from outside. I mean, I've been a little bit hyper focused on Pompeii, so I can say that's one area and we have really good data for. But I think it would be interesting, even outside of the ancient Mediterranean. I'm interested in doing some comparisons. I've looked at some like urban houses in the American South that have that also seem to have spaces for enslaved people, right? So that's something I've been thinking about. But yeah, it's a good avenue that I haven't really pursued yet. Thank you. Yeah, I keep hoping that I'll find some text that like someone else has done some work on this, but it's pretty scant. Yeah, Christine.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. And I kind of want to pick up on a question that Jun started with, and it's wonderful material. And I found those windows really small.
Yes, they're small.
Weirdly small and high. And that's why that little step by the window makes sense for
looking
smallish
out.
human being. So I wanted to know if you have data or you're collecting data of standing on the inside of these rooms and looking out, whether you have the doorways and you have these very different kinds of windows, and what really that view shed is. I mean, how much, if they're in there spying, which is kind of why the window's there, I'm assuming,
maybe,
as opposed to air,
Yeah.
If they're in there, spying, how much can they really see? And if you were a dog or somebody small, you could sneak around in that atrium as you're looking. I mean,
Yeah.
what kind of sense do you have of the many windows you've seen and the door's a little more obvious,
Yes, it
but
is.
it just seems really
Yeah.
difficult to see out of those. So how do you
Yes.
take that?
I totally agree that there's a difficulty with these windows. And the examples that you saw did tend to be there was a few that are high and small because we didn't look at that many together. There's a variety. There's some that are lower, but I'd say tendency they do have to be a little higher and smaller. And I haven't had the opportunity yet to be on the ground and measure all of those things.
You're going in and having a camera and kind of getting the viewscape.
I would love to do that. I would love to do that. It hasn't happened yet. But there's still a lot of data collection for this project. Oh yeah, Ted, do you want to chime in on that?
No, I mean I believe that scene in Wizard of Oz,
Yes.
Yeah.
But I think that maybe it's more that like if you wanted admission to a house, you knew you had to plant yourself in front of that window,
Right,
like yell up
and
to the
say
person or
hello.
whatever.
Yeah.
So it wasn't so much maybe them like scanning outside as this being the portal through which you could.
Right, like it. Peter
Yeah.
Howard Cambridge, right? But what about the inside? You have inside looking into the atrium
Yes.
too, right? I mean, it wasn't
Yes.
only windows on the street; it was also windows or doors.
There are a
looking
few
inside.
windows. I'd say that
Or those aren't as
the
important.
windows into the atrium are kind of an outlier. Like
Okay,
there's
so it's
not
all
very many of
about the
those.
outside. It's all about looking at this.
The windows
Over
tend to be,
looking out.
about looking out. And then I think the doorways are more about looking in.
Okay.
I think you have to add to that windows in that part of the world aren't for looking out.
No.
Like we think
Generally not.
They're for like bringing in some air and light, and people are worried in urban spaces about security. So many of those would have had
Would
an
be
iron grid or
bars or
something.
Right.
Yeah.
Actually, my question follows along very nicely with that comment. I was just thinking during your talk, and it's been kind of crystallized by some of the questions that have
Yeah.
come up. First about the windows again, but also about the purpose of those rooms. And so it's kind of a multi-layered question,
Yeah.
but more to get at the idea of whether or not those are rooms that a doorkeeper stays in or rooms that are a reception room.
Yep.
So I'm thinking like when I do my field work in the Middle East and you go to a traditional house, that you go to a guest house or a guest room
Yes.
first. You don't get invited into the house. You get invited into a special room. And then depending on your relationship with the people in the house, you go to various parts of the house. So I was just thinking, if we thought of those as reception rooms,
Mhm.
then that might explain why they don't have entryways that connect directly to the hallway area, especially if you have a doorkeeper who stays in the hallway. And why you might have two of them that are on either side, because if you have more than one guest at a time, maybe you don't want them interacting with each other. So you would stick them in a reception room. You might also have fancy stuff in there because you want to show off, again, as a thing of display. And
Yeah.
you could have high, small windows because the point is to let air in
Mhm.
and light in particular, not for viewing in
Yes.
and out. And then it got me thinking about the translation of the doorkeeper's room.
Yeah.
So you've translated it in English today as a possessive term.
Yes.
Like that it is a room that the doorkeeper either belongs in or belongs to or has some kind of control over.
Yeah.
But is it the same in
Yeah, it's a genitive. It's the room of the doorkeeper. Like if I was going to be very
Right.
literal.
I'm just
the
wondering
room
if
of
there's
the
a
doorkeeper.
difference in language there, like the room of the doorkeeper versus the doorkeeper's room. Like something that they are in charge of putting people in and taking people out of. And so they have control over the access and entry of that room
Of that
rather than they're
specific room.
stationed in that room. Yeah.
It's an interesting idea. I mean, I do think that those rooms, once again, they're probably multi-purpose, and I'm not saying that every room that we've looked at today is probably a doorkeeper's room. Probably, some of them are very fancy, have these fancy decorations, and I'm not going to say, oh, they just stuck a doorkeeper in there, but maybe they are also for the purpose of reception or for a lot of other purposes. Could be bedrooms, they could be anything. They could be a wide variety of types of rooms, though they're pretty close to the front of the house, which we think of as being a little bit more public. I'll say that just from the literary descriptions of what doorkeepers are doing in the ancient world, generally about just getting into the house, about having access directly from the outside into the inside, and not about going farther into the spaces of the house or being allowed access into specific spaces. It's just like, you know, is this person allowed to enter the premises of the house is mostly the focus. But I do think it's an interesting idea of this. I haven't really thought about that kind of reception room purpose, and that could be another of their of the reasons for these rooms at the front. Yeah, generally rooms in Pompeii, it's kind of frustrating. You're always like, oh, we must know what all the rooms are for, and we don't know what like any of the rooms are for, basically.
I imagine. I mean, you kind of alluded to the fact that there's remodeling, and you know, big houses get chopped up, and small houses get compounded into one large house.
Yeah. And even the stuff we find in each room doesn't make it like clear that like, oh, this was for this or this. We don't even know where they're sleeping. Like, there's no like, it doesn't seem to be bedrooms.
Okay. Thank you, Cesca. So I was wondering if you know if there's an Italian or if there's an effort to do 3D GIS in the site, because it's exceptional preservation, and you actually have, you know, high walls in some places. So most sites are much more eroded. And that would also contribute to the, you know, the views, and like surveillance could happen from the second story.
Oh yeah.
Also the volume, like in terms of the, you know, affluence of the dwelling, the volume of the rooms, you know, the height of the ceilings is a big part of that, but 2D, we're missing that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's any like large scale work on the entire site that's going on to do, but individual properties, people are working on 3D modeling and stuff. There's a team from Cornell that's doing a house that has this big garden that they're working, they just got a big grant to do like a 3D model of. So I think it's work in Pompeii does kind of tend to be individual groups coming to work on kind of specific areas, and that kind of site-wide work is a little slower, I'd say. I don't know, Ted, you don't know any site-wide.
And there's also a team that's mainly German-based at the University of Darmstadt that's been trying to understand better, for instance, the role of natural light and how you could live inside these spaces. So yeah, there are some projects.
Imagine there's good LiDAR, and then you can do geophysics in unexcavated parts.
Yeah.
Do you have any questions online?
There's a question. Yes, I see there's a question from Susanna.
Oh, well.
So we can
the last word.
Yeah, like last word from Susanna. So what are your thoughts so far on the status of an Ostiarius within a household? There seem to be almost conflicting notions of chained people like the guard dogs, but also snobbish doorkeepers who lord it over visitors, and being confined to a small space isn't compelling, to be sure. So yes, this is a great question, and something that I find really interesting of what is the status of the Ostiarius in the house. On the one hand, they seem to be this kind of trusted member of the household who is controlling access, and we see in the literary text that people get mad at them because, you know, it's like, this enslaved person is telling me that I can't come into the house, and like, I'm so important. So they do have this kind of level of control. But I think it is a double-edged sword, right? We see that this person who has specific kind of control more than other enslaved members of the household probably was under closer surveillance in other ways, and that's kind of the chained idea. Though I will say we don't have any archaeological evidence of an actual chained doorkeeper. That's perhaps it was just an older practice, or one that's kind of a literary invention, perhaps because of the connection with dogs. But this is something I'm really interested about. This is one of the bigger kind of overarching themes of the project, is like, there's all these weird things where when enslaved people are in a household and, you know, moving around and having to do certain types of labor, they have to have certain types of access. And how do people control that? And then also, how do enslaved people use that to their advantage? Okay.
Well,
thank
I
you
think
so much.
we're going to say thank you very much, Cesca, for a great talk. And just 1 hour from beginning to end. So well done. Thank you.